History books often tell us that wars are won by armies, by weapons, by technology, by superior numbers. But sometimes, the battlefield itself becomes the greatest weapon. There is a country in Southeast Asia where mountains rise above dense forests, where enormous rivers cut through the land, where tropical rain can transform roads into mud, and where an invading army can disappear without ever truly knowing where the enemy is. This is Vietnam, a long, narrow country pressed between mountains, jungles, rivers, and the sea. For centuries, powerful armies entered Vietnam believing that military strength would be enough. Some arrived with enormous armies, others arrived with modern weapons, aircraft, tanks, and overwhelming firepower. But again and again, they discovered the same problem. Vietnam was not simply a country to conquer, it was a country that had to be understood. Because once an army entered its forests, crossed its rivers, and moved deeper into its mountains, the war began to change. The roads became fewer, the terrain became harder, the weather became unpredictable, and the distance between the invading army and everything it needed to survive grew longer. In Vietnam, the land itself could become an enemy, and sometimes the jungle was more dangerous than the battlefield. So, if you're ready, let's find out why Vietnam became one of the most difficult places in the world for an invading army to truly control. Because to understand Vietnam, you have to look beyond its soldiers. You have to look at the land beneath their feet. Vietnam looks deceptively simple on a map, a long, narrow strip of land stretching along the eastern edge of mainland Southeast Asia. But that shape hides a complicated reality. Vietnam is not one single landscape. It is a collection of different environments, each creating its own challenges. In the north, the terrain rises into mountains. To the west, the Annamite Range forms a long natural barrier, stretching through the heart of mainland Southeast Asia. And between these mountains, rivers cut through the landscape. The Red River Delta, the Mekong Delta, and countless smaller waterways create a world where movement is often dictated by the terrain. Then, there's the jungle. Dense tropical forests cover enormous areas. For an invading army, this creates a fundamental problem. You can see the map, but you cannot always see the battlefield. A large army needs roads. It needs bridges. It needs supply routes. It needs fuel. It needs ammunition. And above all, it needs to know where the enemy is. But Vietnam's geography can make all of these things difficult. A river can slow an advancing force. A mountain can redirect it. A jungle can hide an entire unit. And heavy rain can transform the ground itself. This means that an army entering Vietnam could not simply rely on its strength. It had to move through the landscape on the landscape's terms. And that was the beginning of the problem. Because in Vietnam, the farther an invading army moved, the more complicated the war became. Vietnam's history is filled with powerful empires and powerful armies. But one of the most remarkable examples came in the 13th century, the Mongol Empire. At the height of its power, the Mongols had conquered enormous territories across Asia. Their armies were feared across the continent. But Vietnam presented a different kind of challenge. The Mongols could dominate open land. They could move armies across vast territories. But Vietnam was not the open steppe. It was a land of mountains, forests, rivers, and tropical heat. In the 13th century, Mongol forces launched campaigns into Dien Bien Phu. But the Vietnamese did not simply try to defeat the Mongols in a conventional battle. They used the environment. They avoided unnecessary direct confrontations. They disrupted supply lines. They used the rivers, they used the terrain, and they waited. The Mongol forces could win battles, but winning battles was not the same as controlling Vietnam. The deeper they moved, the more difficult their position became. Their army needed food, it needed supplies, it needed communication, and it needed a way to maintain control over a landscape that was unfamiliar and difficult to navigate. The Mongols had faced powerful enemies before, but Vietnam presented something different. A war where the environment itself could weaken an army. And this pattern would appear again centuries later. Because Vietnam's greatest defensive advantage was not simply its ability to defeat an invading force. It was its ability to make an invading force slow down, stretch out, and eventually lose its strength. Centuries passed. Weapons changed, empires changed, but Vietnam's geography remained. In the 20th century, France attempted to maintain control over French Indochina, and once again, Vietnam's terrain became central to the war. The conflict eventually reached a decisive moment at Dien Bien Phu. The French established a major fortified position in a remote valley in northwestern Vietnam. On paper, the position appeared defensible, but the surrounding terrain told a different story. The Viet Minh managed to move artillery through incredibly difficult terrain and position it around the French forces. The French were surrounded, and the battle became a siege. For weeks, the fighting continued. And on May 7, 1954, the French position fell. The defeat at Dien Bien Phu became one of the most important military events of the 20th century. It demonstrated something that Vietnam's geography had been showing for centuries. Technology matters, firepower matters, but geography can change how those advantages are used. And then, another war arrived, one that would make Vietnam famous across the world. The Vietnam War. This time, the United States possessed one of the most technologically advanced militaries on Earth. Aircraft filled the skies, helicopters moved troops, armored vehicles entered the battlefield, and enormous amounts of firepower were deployed. But Vietnam was not a conventional battlefield. The jungle created concealment, the mountains created obstacles, the rivers divided the country, and the enemy often refused to fight on the terms the United States preferred. The battlefield was no longer simply an army against an army. It became an army against a landscape, and that landscape had no intention of surrendering. There is something every army needs, no matter how powerful it is: supplies, fuel, food, ammunition, reinforcements, and the ability to move them where they are needed. Because an army does not fight on weapons alone, it fights on logistics, and Vietnam was a logistical nightmare. Imagine, for a moment, a modern army trying to move thousands of soldiers through a dense tropical jungle. Now look at the path beneath their feet. A narrow trail, barely wide enough for a few people. Mud, roots, steep slopes, rivers, and rain. Now imagine trying to move fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, and heavy equipment through that same landscape. This is where the real problem begins, because every soldier at the front creates another demand behind him. Every vehicle needs fuel, every weapon needs ammunition, every soldier needs food and water, every wounded soldier needs evacuation, and every supplies has to travel from somewhere. On a normal road, an army can move enormous quantities of material, but deep inside Vietnam's forests, the road may disappear entirely, and suddenly, the most advanced army in the world can find itself facing a very simple question. How do you keep thousands of people supplied when the land itself does not want you to move? This is the hidden battle of Vietnam, not always the battle you see on the screen, but the battle happening behind it. The fight to keep the army alive, the fight to keep the ammunition moving, the fight to keep the fuel flowing, and the fight to keep the supply lines open. Because the farther an army advances, the longer those supply lines become, and the longer they become, the more vulnerable they become. In Vietnam, distance was not just distance, it was time, it was fuel, it was manpower, it was vulnerability, and eventually, it became exhaustion. An army could win a battle and still face another problem. How do you keep the army there? How do you keep thousands of soldiers supplied when the roads are limited, the terrain is difficult, and the weather can change everything? Aircraft could fly over mountains. Helicopters could reach remote areas. But even modern technology had limits. Heavy equipment still needed fuel, soldiers still needed food, ammunition still had to arrive, and bases still had to be protected. The jungle could hide movement, the mountains could slow it, and the weather could disrupt it. This created a fundamental problem. An invading force could enter Vietnam, but controlling the country was an entirely different challenge. Because occupying territory is one thing, maintaining control is another, and Vietnam's geography made that second task far more difficult. The problem was no longer simply, can you defeat the enemy? The problem became, can you sustain your army in a country that seems determined to make every kilometer expensive? And that is where Vietnam's geography became more than a defensive advantage. It became a war of endurance. Vietnam teaches us one of the most important lessons in military history. Sometimes, a country's greatest defense is not its army. Sometimes, it is the land itself, its mountains, its forests, its rivers, its climate, and the enormous distances between one battlefield and the next. Throughout history, powerful armies entered Vietnam. The Mongols came, the French came, and in the 20th century, the United States entered the conflict with overwhelming technological power. But again and again, the same problem appeared. To fight in Vietnam, you had to fight Vietnam itself. You had to cross the mountains, you had to move through the jungle, you had to cross the rivers, you had to survive the climate, and you had to keep your soldiers supplied while the battlefield constantly changed around you. Vietnam was never impossible to conquer, but controlling it was something else entirely. Because you can defeat an army, you can destroy a fortress, you can capture a city, but what happens when the entire country becomes the battlefield? Maybe that is the greatest lesson of Vietnam. Sometimes, the strongest defense a country can have is not the weapon in its hands. It is the ground beneath its feet. So, what do you think makes a country truly difficult to conquer? Mountains, jungles, deserts, oceans, or the ability of its people to turn the land itself into a weapon? Let me know what you think in the comments. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to Mythic Wildlife for more cinematic documentaries exploring the world's most extraordinary places and the incredible stories hidden within them. In the next episode, we're heading to another country where nature itself seems to have built a fortress. I'm Ask Studio. Thank you for joining me on this journey for Mythic Wildlife. Until next time, may the power of nature be with you. Stay curious, and remember, sometimes the greatest weapon is the land itself. New one.